I want to start out by introducing my fellow panelists today. They include Dora Brzezinski from Deloitte, Philip Austin from BDO, Matt Doyle from KPMG, and Mike Sante from Grant Thornton. I would like to thank all of you for joining virtually today for what I hope will be a highly topical discussion on group audits, particularly given the recent focus of regulators, legislators, and even the executive branch, particularly as it relates to emerging markets. We will be touching on how standard setting has evolved in this space, how a group auditor exercises oversight over component auditors, and also some of the recent regulatory activity around group audits. We have a lot of ground to cover and want to keep time at the end to cover questions that you will have. So we'll dive right in. But before we do, we actually had produced a brief video with Chris Dinkle from PwC and Dan Sutherland from Northeastern University, formerly of Deloitte, to tee up the discussion and introduce the concept of group audits. So let's roll the video.
There's been a tremendous focus on audit quality around the world over the last 10 years. While this drive to quality is a worldwide goal, it is also a jurisdictional goal. Each country wants robust and transparent oversight of the auditors or auditing companies listed on their respective jurisdictional exchanges. These auditors and the companies they are auditing may, on the one hand, reside in the same jurisdiction as the regulator, or they may be located in different jurisdictions than the regulator, but still be subject to the regulator rules.
There is also recognition that many of these auditors are also using other auditors from different jurisdictions and executing their audits of a set of consolidated financial statements, whether that be within their network of affiliated firms or through the involvement of an unrelated firm. And when that's the case, regulators also would like to be able to inspect the work performed by those auditors and ensure the group auditor has maintained sufficient oversight of the work performed by those auditors in determining that it's appropriate for them to use that work in support of the group audit. When you think about a multinational corporation with operations in multiple jurisdictions, how the entity is organized, where it operates, the management reporting structure, and how financial information is processed and flows through financial systems and applications, the result is multiple challenges that group auditors face, including the fact there may be potential changes in auditing standards.
So let's discuss group audits from an individual engagement perspective. One thing that you need to understand, really what we would call the sine qua non, are a couple of critical terms that relate to the execution of multi-jurisdictional audits. The group auditor is the auditor that takes ultimate responsibility for the reporting on the consolidated financial statements and, where applicable, rendering an opinion on ICFR. The buck generally stops with the group auditor, although in some limited instances in the US only, the group auditor may specifically reference a component auditor in the group auditor's report. Now, the group auditor uses component auditors to help in executing the audit. These component auditors, in the context of our discussion today, are located in various countries throughout the world. They may or they may not necessarily be affiliates of the group auditor, which presents a whole host of issues in and of itself. In the context of the consolidated financial statements, the group auditor tells the component auditor what to do on its behalf. The group auditor has a responsibility to supervise and review the work of the component auditor. There is a constant trade-off in the group auditor's mind between, can I do it better myself, or should I delegate it? The component auditor may also have separate statutory responsibilities, but those do not fall under the group auditor's purview.
From a firm perspective, performing group audits across multiple jurisdictions can lead to increased complexities and different challenges. I'll mention a few. First, ensuring consistent quality and execution across a population of member network firms participating in the group audit, as well as non-affiliated firms which need to be used where there is no coverage in the firm or when used at the client's request, which may be the case when dealing with joint venture arrangements, and review and supervision of component audit teams and the impact of various privacy and confidentiality laws. All these lead us to focus on what the regulators are interested in and concerned with, whether that be at the individual engagement level through the normal inspection regime, or at the firm level in its system of quality controls and how quality is achieved and maintained across a formal or informal network.
Okay, so we're back, and I want to thank Chris and Dan for the video. So let's jump right in. Section 1 will be evolution of standard setting. So Matt, we'll start with you. What are some of the key decisions and/or judgments that auditors must make when planning for a group audit?
Well, the first step is to decide whether their audit is a group audit. And a group audit is the audit of an entity made up of components. And AUC 600 offers a definition of that, but it's an elastic term. And a lot of times, especially in the context of the multinational audits we're talking about, they can be distinct legal subsidiaries, but they don't have to be. They can be unincorporated divisions or sub-consolidations of many legal subsidiaries. They can be equity method investments. They can be a lot of things. Multinationals are often comprised of dozens and dozens of components. So a key planning decision in a group audit is about scoping, determining which entities will be in scope. And to cut to the chase for our purposes, it can be helpful to think of that decision in reverse. That is, determining which entities will not be in scope. And here, as everywhere, the fundamental audit risk model drives our thinking. We scope the group audit such that there is less than a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement is present in those out-of-scope entities, either individually or in aggregate. But having determined the population of components in scope for the group auditor, you set component materiality, and that is, after having determined the overall materiality for the group as a whole, the group auditor sets component materiality for each of the individual components at values that are lower than the group materiality, and in a manner which addresses group aggregation risk, which is the risk that the aggregate of uncorrected or undetected misstatements exceeds materiality for the group. So then the group auditors make other key judgments related broadly to the involvement of the component auditor, and I'll just note 3 of them. First is the division of audit responsibilities between the group auditor and the component auditor, areas for which the group auditor will take over overall responsibility, and those areas that the component auditor will, with supervision and review from the group auditor. And the second, the group auditor decides how they'll scope that involvement of the component auditor, ranging from a full scope audit to perhaps audits of specified accounts and transactions, down to specified procedures that the group auditor would dictate to the component auditor. And then lastly, the group auditor makes decisions on the level of its involvement in the supervision of the component audit. The level of involvement and supervision generally varies depending upon the significance and risks associated with a component. For example, that could range from periodic communication and review of reporting deliverables to performing good old-fashioned site visits and component audit locations, meeting with component management, reviewing component audit work papers, and performing joint procedures.
Great, thanks, Matt. Dora, back in 2016, the PCAOB proposed amendments and a new auditing standard relating to the supervision of audits involving other auditors and dividing responsibility for the audit with another accounting firm. What are some of the key changes related to group audits that were included in the PCAOB's proposals?
Yeah, thanks. So, I think one of the first things to think about, as Matt said, is, are you actually using a component auditor or other auditor? And once that decision gets made, there is some, or has historically been some, inconsistency in how the group engagement team or the lead auditor approaches that direction and supervision. And so part of the PCAOB's proposal really was to try and drive some of that consistency in how firms actually approached using other auditors. So broadly, the proposal requires that the group engagement team or the lead auditor get an understanding of their other auditors or component auditors, SEC, PCAO independence, their ethics, and their experience in applying the auditing standards and performing an audit. And then the proposed standard prescribes certain procedures that the lead auditor would perform. So this starts with determining whether or not they're going to be able to communicate with the other auditors, whether or not they'll actually be able to gain access to working papers if that's necessary. But it also included then a few other requirements as it related to the auditor determining what else they might need. So if there's additional work that they need to see or additional review that needs to be performed, that's part of the things that the lead auditor needs to decide. And then the lead auditor, of course, also has to inform the other auditor of the scope of the work that they want them to perform. And in addition to that, obtain and review the other auditor's description of the nature, timing, and extent of the procedures that they're going to be performing. Along with that, the lead auditor then also obtains either a written report or some document that describes the procedures, the findings, the conclusions. In some circumstances, this could include an opinion based on what the other auditor performed. And then finally, from a documentation standpoint, the proposal required that the lead auditor maintain a specific list of some of the other auditors' working papers that were reviewed, but not retained within the lead auditor's file. So those are really some of the key highlights as it related to a group audit. There were also some enhancements as it related to dividing responsibility or making reference.
Thank you, Dora. Philip, let me come to you. What was the profession's view on these proposed changes, and what about other constituents? What were their views on the proposals?
Thanks, George. What was interesting is in looking at the commentators, there was only one preparer that put in a comment letter to the proposal, and that preparer was more focused on divided responsibility than the other aspects. I think we can assume that they may have misdirected their attention. The audit profession broadly was in a supportive position. So if you look across the CAQ and audit firms, the firms look for more certainty on certain aspects, in particular the challenges of access to work papers when those weren't available, and some of the matters around cross-jurisdictional considerations in licensing, but broadly supportive with specific suggestions to the PCAOB. Some of the US institutes, whether that is in New York or California or Illinois, in their commentary focused particular concern around whether there was a necessity to look at the skills, knowledge, and experience of participating auditors. I'm not sure where those comments go, George, because the standard addresses more than US auditors, and much of their commentary revolved around the strong regulatory regime in the United States. The interesting part was foreign oversight bodies, and whether it was the European Federation of Accountants or it was the ICAEW, there were certainly some less than positive views being expressed. The one that I quote that probably gives the best sense for those participants comes from the European Federation of Accountants. And they said in their submission, the proposals taken as a whole seem to be underpinned by a belief that lead auditors should trust no one, except when obliged to, and that they should seek to perform work themselves wherever possible, end quote. The ICAEW also had a comment in their overall comment letter that they viewed the proposals as being headed towards the lead auditor doing everything and not pursuing the delegation that they thought appropriate, as did the Institute in Germany. Just interesting seeing how other organizations commented. Of course, it was 4 years ago, and we'll talk about ISA 600 during today's discussion. I think some of the amendments to the ISA may be heading in exactly the same direction.
Thanks, Philip. Mike, let's shift gears a bit to the international auditing standards. Back in April, the IAASB released a proposal for ISA 600 special considerations, audits of group financial statements, including work of component auditors. Can you summarize for us the background and the international landscape that led the IASB to release this proposal, and maybe what are some of the key changes that are being proposed?
And the background on this one goes back a few years, George. I think the IAASB started their post-implementation review of their initial launch of ISA 600 back in 2013. So the years seem to fly by when you're having fun looking at group. That led to an invitation to comment that the IAASB issued in 2015, and the primary focus of that invitation was audit quality. Group audits was one key aspect of that, but there was also a focus on skepticism and the quality control standards, which I think we've got a panel going to talk about that later in this symposium. So very timely on that invitation to comment. So, if you think of the list that Matt started us with respect to what are the key judgments, those were also some of the key challenges that auditors were having with the application of ISA 600 and in the U.S. AUC 600. So, think about what is a component. When am I in the group audit standard? I think there was some confusion, I think sometimes around the fact that the group audit standard applies when I have a group audit and not just when I'm using another auditor. And so I think that was part of the challenges that some of the firms were having, some of the auditors were having. What's the nature and extent and timing of that component auditor work, right? How much work do they need to do when they're doing an audit of a component as adapted? So there were some practical challenges. There was also some regulator concerns with respect to, and I think Philip touched on some of this, the supervision and review aspects of a group audit, how much involvement that the group auditor was having in the component audit. So some regulator concerns around that. Are we getting risk assessment right? And that's kind of Matt, that was one of your overall comments is, getting the scoping right on a group audit. And not getting caught up in the form of the standard as opposed to what the substance of getting an appropriate audit, quality of the audit right. So some of the key changes, George, just to run through those. It's interesting the timing on this, as you say, it came out in April, so right in advance of the pandemic. So from a fit for purpose perspective, this is going to certainly inform the comment letters that you would think the IAASB is going to get. The comment period ends in October. They're looking to better link this to the risk assessment standards, the 315, ISA 315, and ISA 330. ISA 315 just changed, and they're also looking to link this better to the quality control standards, in particular engagement performance, ISA 220, which is in process of changing. So for you Star Trek fans, it's kind of like transwarp beaming while they're trying to get group audits right while the other standards are changing. Focusing on some of the other key changes, focusing on the leadership responsibilities for the group auditor, reminding the group audit engagement partner that they are responsible for the entire audit, but trying to balance what the component auditor is also responsible for, that enhancing that communication to get the risk assessment right. It's a longer standard. I could keep going on some of the changes. I think it's a greater focus on planning, some enhanced requirements around documentation, and then in weaving in the concept of skepticism, enhancing skepticism, requiring a stand back at the end of the group audit. Do I get this right? Do I have the documentation right? Anything from a risk perspective that I may have missed. So a lot of changes, and we'll see where that standard goes as the IAASB deliberates further.
All right, thank you, Mike. Maybe Dora, one for you. How does the proposal under ISA 600 requirements compare to the existing PCAOB auditing standards here in the U.S., as well as maybe any notable differences on some of the key judgments that Matt mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Mike just mentioned from a risk assessment perspective is that the ISA 600 proposed standards does place a fairly heavy emphasis on understanding the differences that result from an entity being a group. And so it builds on 315 from a risk assessment, but really tries to get into some of those complexities of a group, which might be having a shared service center or centralized activities or group level type controls and how those items influence the audit. So that's one area that's a little bit different than the PCAOB's proposed standard and their current standard on direction supervision. Although that being said, the ISA also does build on some of the requirements that the PCAOB standard has from a multi-location audit perspective. And so the ISA then goes on to deal with considerations when component auditors are involved, which is sort of the second half of the standard. And it takes a very principles-based approach. So it does provide explicit recognition that the audit and the group engagement team or the lead auditor may need assistance from the component auditors. And so it tries to build in that two-way communication and that relationship that can occur between the group engagement team and the component auditors or the other auditors, and how there may be requests for work performed, and how does the lead auditor engage with that component auditor to make sure that they still have enough information and knowledge to take responsibility for the audit. So I think those are probably some of the key, compare contrast with the PCAOB standards, George.
Yeah, thanks, Dora. So let's move into supervision and review of component auditors. And we'll start with you, Dora. Now that we've got some of the background on the key elements of group audit and the evolution of the auditing standards, moving into supervision and review of the component auditor, maybe a basic question to start off with. How is the lead or the principal auditor determined under the current PCAOB auditing standards?
Right, and a very important determination, because that's the lead auditor is the one who's going to be signing that audit opinion, that audit report. So under the PCAOB standards, the principal auditor, lead auditor has to decide whether their own participation is sufficient for them to serve in that capacity. And so what does sufficient actually mean? And one of the key items that goes into this consideration is going to be the materiality of the portion of the financial statements that the lead auditor has audited in comparison with the portion audited by other auditors or component auditors. So the standard somewhat sets up this expectation that the portion of the financial statements audited by the lead auditor is going to be greater than that of the other auditors, or that the other auditor's portion is not really material. So you've got that as a bit of a baseline, and then you get into some more qualitative factors, such as the lead auditors or group engagement teams' extent of their overall knowledge of the financial statements, and then the importance of the portions audited by the lead auditor. So that steps you back a bit from the quantitative aspects into thinking about maybe more significant judgments, significant estimates, and how those may play a greater role from an importance standpoint. And so then also there's the standpoint in thinking about whether the work was performed under the control or under the guidance of the lead auditor. And so you put all of those pieces together, and the lead auditor, principal auditor, makes that decision as to whether they're really in that position to issue that audit report.
Great. Philip, let me come to you. Communication is one of the key elements of a group audit, and we know that communication requirements are embedded in the PCAOB standards. So the question is, what are some of the key communications between the principal auditor and the component auditors that you believe are most critical to the performance of a group audit, and why might that be?
Sure. And George, the interesting part with the PCAOB standard and the revised ISA 600 is the increasing emphasis on supervision by the group auditor. That's the actions that the group auditor takes to direct and assign tasks and activities. And that's the element that sits behind each of the communication elements. You start at the very top, and in the acceptance process, the group auditor is wanting to communicate with the proposed component auditor around their qualification to serve, addressing independence requirements, ethics requirements, knowledge and expertise. What kind of standards does that firm audit under? What kind of experience have they had through their regulatory process? When applicable, are they registered? When required, has the location done the necessary work to be up to date on their own education around applicable auditing standards, accounting and financial reporting standards? And then what's the nature of the team and knowledge that's going to be assigned? And then the communication goes across, once acceptance is behind, to understanding what the component audit firm's responsibilities will be, the component audit team's obligations to provide information to the group auditor, And then there's question around access to underlying audit documentation, which I know we'll come back to later on. And then it's through the process of the audit, the group auditor and the component audit communicating with each other around the progress of the risk assessment, the results of the risk assessment evidence, the nature of the procedures that are being planned, when the work is going to be performed and who is going to be performing the work, the results of the work that has been performed, the findings, and then as a consequence of the findings, the nature of what the component auditor would communicate to the group auditor in their overall findings and outcome documentation and the communications. So a pretty extensive piece, enough for the group auditor to direct the tasks that have been assigned, to understand the work that's being performed, and to receive and respond to the information around what the audit at the component discovered.
Thanks, Philip. Matt, as global network firms, we have to deal with the fact that many of the component teams' first language may not be English. How has the profession here in the U.S. overcome the language barrier to ensure effective communication and review between the principal auditor and component auditors is happening?
Well, first, I think we should acknowledge that this is a challenge that has gotten a lot easier over the course of our own careers, over which time the population of English as a second language speakers has grown very rapidly to about 1 in 4 persons on the planet, with a significant concentration in business and therefore in accounting and auditing. And part of that is reflected by our clients, more and more of whom are mandating English as the common corporate language. Notable examples being companies like Airbus and Daimler and Samsung. And, English language skills feature prominently in the job market, and we see that in our global member firms, where the staff focus on the continued development of those language skills, and where many of the partners and managers speak English very well indeed, particularly those serving global audits. That said, it's still an issue and an important consideration, one that was highlighted by the PCAOB in 2010 with SAPA 6. And one way that global network firms have managed that risk is by taking a page from some of our clients and mandating the use of English in inter-firm reporting, such that even if the underlying component work papers aren't in English, the group audit reporting and things like salient feature memoranda are in English. And I guess, beyond that, global network firms benefit from the use of things like global policies and procedures, including globally consistent audit methodologies, standardized work papers. These really help teams better communicate and facilitates the review of work papers. In addition, many member firms have a select group of partners and staff with an accreditation to participate in certain audits. For example, in order to participate on a PCAOB group audit, the partner and staff may have to have certain levels of training and experience on PCAOB audits. So naturally, these individuals tend to spend more time participating on those types of global engagements and have more experience and spend more time working and communicating with group auditors. And just lastly, the other feature I would note is global network firms also have partners and staff on secondment assignments in member firms. And these individuals generally participate in group audits and serve as sort of consultative resources to group and component audit teams and really help facilitate communications and otherwise enhance audit quality.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Philip, so we've talked about communication. Let's move to work paper reviews. Can you summarize what component audit team work papers are required to be reviewed by the principal auditor under existing PCAOB standards, and who maintains responsibility for the quality of such component team work under the current standards?
George, before I do that, I just want to add on to some of what Matt described. What Matt described works incredibly well from a US principal auditor to component auditor perspective. Some of the challenge is the number of audits that are led by non-US parent auditors. For example, very large concentrations in Asia, where the Chinese parent audit firm might be performing much of their work in work papers that are expressed in local language. And the same applies to other geographies, even in parts of Europe where local law requires work papers to be maintained in a language other than English. And we see that happening in places like Russia, Portugal, Spain, and France. So one of the things that I think is important is this leg of the standardized methodology forms and templates. They certainly help because you can apply questionnaires behind to see what the English equivalents are. certainly the use of people with language skills, which I think Matt described, and increasingly using technology to overlay and interpret or translate the work paper content to allow people to see what's in the content in, albeit not 100% accurate, at least a proximate accuracy translation. That's pretty much something I think we're seeing emerge across technology platforms, because while Matt's right, people have conversant English skills, we still see quite a lot of local condition resulting in local work papers that include non-English language records of work done. On the communication side, I think Dora described what's in the current standard really well earlier on, so I'm not going to repeat that. The one piece of the comment letter process that stood out was the PCAOB's proposal to require the principal auditor to maintain a list of the index of the work papers that were reviewed of the component auditor that were not transferred into the principal auditor's custody. So this would be where, as a group auditor, I review work papers of another location, and having looked at those work papers, I don't transfer copies of the papers to my file. The requirement would be an index of those papers. That's triggered a lot of discussion and dialogue, including the constraint of what about places where access to those work papers is restricted by local law or regulation, or to the extent that looking at those work papers can only be facilitated through going to the location. And just for those who are studying this kind of topic, Germany is a good example of a very advanced country that has extremely strict regulation on the access to work papers that causes auditors to have to think carefully about how to achieve that. And I think that's probably one of the larger challenges in the current proposal set. If an auditor is unable to see work papers, then I guess the index of work papers seen will say, I didn't see any work papers. And there was certainly substantial comment from parties on what do you do in those circumstances where you otherwise would have liked to see, but now you're unable to for one reason or another.
Yep, Philip, maybe a quick follow-up. Is there much difference in the level of supervision and review of a component auditor located in a jurisdiction that has less active audit regulation? Do we see that as compared to maybe other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think there are two answers here, George. One would be a principle of should there be. Anytime you're dealing with a profession that is less rigorously regulated, has less frequent regulatory oversight, has less restrictive regulatory requirements, is not operating with the same kind of independent audit regulator or independent stock exchange regulator presence in that market, the auditor at the group level should respond to that information. That's the easy principle answer. It gets really, really more difficult when you talk about specific locations. Many locations that don't have active audit regulators or active stock exchange regulation, where regulators are reaching into the preparers, equally don't have a very mature profession. And then it gets really hard because the group auditor is trying to deal with all those complexities. Where the location auditor fits within a global network firm, those particular constraints get much easier because you have the global network controls that are applicable. And that tends to improve the quality of the firm locally compared to firms that are not in the global network firms. That, of course, creates a whole nother question around market participation and who does audits and what the nature is when you hit an emerging market with low auditor regulation and you step outside of a global network firm or a firm that has some kind of network of quality control around the globe.
Thank you, Philip. Let's move on to another topic, one that gets a lot of attention between auditors and their clients, and that's statutory audit. So maybe Dora, coming to you, many of the components that are part of a group audit oftentimes also require a local statutory audit for local jurisdiction purposes. Depending on the entity and the audit firm, today many statutory audits are done centrally by a shared service center group of people, or some are still being done locally by the component team. Can you describe for us how statutory audits are considered in the group audit and how that may impact the level of supervision and review that occurs of the component auditor, depending on who completes that statutory audit work?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially because outside of the US, there are a lot of jurisdictions that require a lot of statutory audits when you start looking at these larger group audits themselves. And so there's a few different ways to look at this. I think the first is that sometimes that work that's performed for a statutory audit, it can occur at the same time as the work that needs to be performed for the group audit. And so you've got involvement from a group engagement team perspective, a lead auditor perspective in that work, in understanding it, in overseeing it. And then really that work is used for two purposes. And then you've got more of a scenario where perhaps that doesn't occur and the group engagement, the group audit is actually finished, and now you've got a statutory audit that needs to be performed. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is a big move towards a shared service center model or a centralized testing locations where certain parts of controls and processes for the entire group, for the entire consolidated entity are performed perhaps at one location or a couple different locations. And so this causes some complexities as well as the potential for simplicities when you think about how that statutory work is performed. So in some instances, we've seen how the auditors of the shared service center, sometimes that's the group engagement team, and sometimes it's a team at that local jurisdiction, they are doing the work for the statutory auditor. So either they plan the group engagement to make sure that they've got various different testing selections for those statutory audits so that they can be most effective and efficient, or you've got statutory auditors who are requesting the auditors at those shared service centers or centralized locations to perform the work for them. And oftentimes, even that is still an efficiency because the team that's at that shared service center, they understand what's going on and they understand the processes and the controls and the transactions. So that can be a pretty efficient way of actually getting that work done. The hang up here is really oftentimes in that local jurisdiction. There's still the auditor in that jurisdiction, the licensed professional to actually sign that audit report. And to sign that audit report, the auditing standards need to be applied in an appropriate manner. And so you've got that backdrop of still needing the auditor of those statutory audit financial statements to be involved and directly and appropriately supervise. And so while you may have a scenario where the bulk of the work on the financial statements and even the financial statements themselves could be produced by that shared service center, you've got duplicate work that oftentimes still needs to happen at that jurisdictional level because of those regulatory jurisdictional requirements for an audit report to be issued. And so, I really think in order to solve some of these issues, we need to be engaging with regulators, and we need to recognize what are we actually trying to accomplish here, who's in the best position to actually do this audit work, and have we set up some artificial barriers to really having an effective and efficient audit done because of some of those long-standing statutory audit type rules and regulations that exist in these other countries.
Yeah, thank you, Dora. So let's move on to audit planning and execution in the current environment. So Mike, with all the disruption and change in the marketplace currently, one of the first things that comes to mind is risk assessment. Can you briefly describe for us the auditor's risk assessment process for group audits under PCAOB standards, and who's performing such assessment? The principal auditor, the component auditor, or is it a joint effort?
Typically, it's going to be a joint effort for all the things we've just been kind of talking through on the session here. And just from a clarification perspective too, I know we're talking about the risk assessment under PCAOB standards, and I think as you've been hearing and so we've been talking about, most of the larger multinational audit firms have kind of taken the ISO 600 approach, right? We've been talking about group audits, component audits. I mean, those are terms that you're not. They are technically in the PCAOB standards. At least I haven't seen them there, Dora, unless they're in there. They haven't adopted them yet. But we talked about the PCAOB concept release that came out earlier in the proposed standards, and looking at perhaps some alignment with where both standard setting bodies are going. So in taking that ISO 600 approach, in a PCAOB audit, typically we're going to look at what are the significant where's the significant components? From a risk perspective, starts with the group auditor. Where am I going to need to do my work, and what component auditors am I going to need to use, right? And so, you mentioned the current environment. So I think you kind of get in a routine. Some of these larger multinationals where you've got tens and tens or hundreds of components, or maybe in the hundreds of components for some really large audits. You kind of get in a routine of same as last year. Like, okay, I know where I'm going. I know what I need to look at. And I think what the challenge for teams this year is going to be is it's not going to be same as last year, right? Given the implications of where the challenges have come from a what industry you might be in, maybe that the risk from a going concern, and some of the other we've seen a lot of the releases on challenges with auditing estimates and looking at different forecasted information, the changes. It's going to be quite different. So from a risk assessment perspective, I think this notion of both being involved, I think Dora highlighted a lot of what just talking about with statutory audits. You've got component auditors out there who are going to be doing statutory audits. We need to leverage, I think we're going to see group audit teams leveraging those discussions earlier on as to what they're looking at from the component and what the statutory risks are going to be. I think the standards requirements, are the same with respect to, we need to communicate what the significant risks are. We're going to need to communicate related parties, the different things that the group auditor, starts with from what the component auditor needs to be thinking about, depending on the work they need to do. If you just need a component auditor to do an inventory observation or do cash, that risk assessment with that component auditor is going to be different. But than you would if you need a full audit, because it's a very different component in its own kind of industry. So I think the challenges are going to be heightened. I think the communication aspects that Philip and others have been talking about are going to be more important than ever. I think understanding changes that management has made in the reporting structure, in the controls that they're operating, how they're dealing with remote workforce. It's going to be an interesting year, and I think that most of the firms have already seen that coming and are gearing up for it from a risk assessment perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Matt, maybe a bit of a follow-up. Anything to add as it relates specifically to COVID-19 and the related economic uncertainty it brings with it, and what impact that may have had with respect to auditor risk assessment for group audits? Has it changed the process, or even the engagement of different personnel involved in those discussions currently?
Yeah, I mean, in this environment, our mantra has been continuous risk assessment, like Mike talked about. The pandemic has accelerated the pace of change that our audit plans are subjected to, and really put a premium on cooperation between the group and component auditors. You can think of these as external and internal risks. Like the external risks include all the accounting and auditing implications of the pandemic, which are incredibly wide-ranging and diverse in terms of how they impact different entities. And internal risks include the things like changes to processes that entities are making in response to things like lockdown. Some processes are getting changed to accommodate remote working conditions, and sometimes that means internal controls need to change and group audits need to change in response to those. But in terms of changes in process and personnel involved, we're seeing more frequent touch points and communications between group and component teams. We're seeing more senior engagement team personnel participating in those discussions. I think group auditors are taking a more active role in risk assessment procedures at the component level. For example, by participating directly in meetings with component management on key audit areas like estimates. And we're also seeing more multifunctional involvement. For example, tax professionals to understand the regulatory and government relief measures that are out there, or valuation specialists to assist with all those estimates around valuation and impairment, and forensic professionals to assist in fraud risk assessments. And lastly, I would say we're also seeing more consultations with national office resources.
Thanks for that, Matt. Philip, another area that has come to light recently relates to the risks of investing in emerging markets. A number of audits of US-based multinational entities have operations, sometimes significantly, that are abroad, including some in emerging markets. So how, if at all, might having components located in emerging markets impact the risk assessment process that the principal auditor undertakes?
Yeah, George, when we say emerging markets, we probably all have a different set of countries and locations in mind. So perhaps to give us some boundary to this question, I think what we're referring to is markets where the regulatory framework, the local money laundering or similar regulations, the business practices may not be what we're used to. There may be more graft occurring or more underhanded ways of people doing business locally, or the infrastructure may lack the kind of competent resources that the entity ordinarily has. So those kinds of markets in the auditing literature are continually pointed to as places where there are increased location-driven risks related to fraud in the financial statements, often are present that may not be present elsewhere. Supply chain manipulation may be present. The lack of competent personnel may increase the risk of error just because people are not attuned to the requirements of the accounting framework applied, be that IFRS or US GAAP. Or there may be lapses in internal control due to resource constraints causing people to do work that otherwise would have appropriate segregation of duties. So what the group auditor gets into is trying to understand, and let's assume for the moment it's a very material location, the conditions present on the ground. And if that were a couple of countries in South America that maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where there was very major systemic corporate fraud being reported on, there were known issues around how that was impacting the financial markets, including SEC registrants, then that would impact how the auditor responds. If you were thinking of other countries where perhaps infrastructural deficits and the competency of personnel was a major constraint, that would change the risks that the group auditor would think around those locations. And the way the group auditor thinks about the monitoring controls and how the corporation, the entity being audited, ensures that their control objectives and their control framework is being consistently applied in that location, all of which may cause the group auditor to perform additional procedures to look at what work gets done at the location, what work gets done at the group parent office, what site visits the principal auditor may engage in, and what kind of additional evidential matter to go and seek just to close down those risks. Again, very driven off of the location and the risks that are there, and as Dora described earlier, the relative significance of that location to the group audit.
Thank you, Philip. Dora, in the current environment with a majority of our clients' workforces still operating remotely and the economic uncertainty that continues to persist, there is the potential for an organization's maybe heightened susceptibility to risk of fraud. How has the pandemic changed the manner in which group audit teams assess fraud risks and execute audit procedures to respond to them, if at all? And what are the conversations that the lead team are having with component teams about the heightened risk of fraud?
Sure, and I think there definitely has been a change in how teams are thinking about this. Certainly the economic volatility that has been experienced, that companies are experiencing, are going to potentially give rise to either new risks of material misstatement or perhaps heightened or significant risks of material misstatement. And so as we think about those general risks of material misstatements, we then need to really think about the potential for fraud occurring. And this is something that we've been doing for years, and we've got our fraud brainstorming activities that we engage in. But I think there's a bit of a twist on it now with the working remotely from our clients and entity management. We've always generally thought about the fraud triangle and the opportunity, the incentives, the rationalization. But I do think when you think about our current remote working environments, that opportunity is something that perhaps didn't quite exist before, or it exists now in a bit of a different manner. So perhaps controls aren't working as well. Those controls are always important to preventing fraud. Or perhaps there's just a different mindset from personnel, and that people can't see them doing their work. And so maybe some of those attitudes and thoughts about why fraud would be committed have changed a bit. And so we need to really think carefully about what are those areas where we think a fraud risk might occur, and then think about it in the remote environment, and think about it in the context of fraud schemes, and how would things perhaps be perpetuated differently in this environment where we perhaps, again, know that controls are different, people are acting different, levels of documentation and nature of documentation might be different. And so those are the conversations that our teams are having right now as they think through what they might have assessed early on in the audit as a fraud risk. And perhaps, there are now additional fraud risks, or just the way, the nature, the scheme that might be perpetrated is going to be a little bit different in this environment. And then I think you take those learnings from a group engagement team perspective and you think about them at your components. And so from a direction and supervision standpoint, it's very important for the group engagement team or group auditor to know what are their component teams doing? Are they having these same conversations? The time and the effort and the work that group engagement teams are spending on their fraud risk assessment? Are we making sure that our component auditors, especially those in different jurisdictions outside of the US, are going through those same activities? And are we providing our knowledge and insight, especially from a group perspective, into those components and that component work, so that we can make sure our component auditors are also responding appropriately? And of course, I'd also be remiss in saying that from a risk assessment standpoint, the group engagement team really does need to be thinking about those jurisdictions, those components where fraud risks in themselves have increased because of this environment. And the group really does play a key role in making sure that in its entirety we responded appropriately to that risk of fraud.
Yeah, it highlights the need to make sure that the auditor is still having discussions with their client, maybe with the audit committee, about what changes to the control structure, what processes might need to be altered in light of everyone working remotely, particularly if that likelihood is prolonged into into the ensuing number of months and maybe throughout the balance of the year. It's one thing to cope with it in a very short period of time as opposed to a more prolonged period of time. So it's definitely something that needs continuous attention. As someone on the panel said earlier, our risk assessment is a continuous process, and no doubt the fraud risk assessment is part of that as well. Mike, let me come to you with a question. Pre-pandemic, one of the more common procedures the principal auditor would have performed as part of their effective oversight of the component team was to conduct site visits to the locations abroad, depending on the significance of the component and the various risk factors that were present or identified. Have the travel restrictions that have been put in place in response to COVID-19 impacted the principal auditor's ability to exercise oversight, and how has the audit profession adapted to ensure appropriate oversight continues even in a virtual environment?
That's a good question. George, and just real quick before I jump into this one, I wanted to highlight, you mentioned fraud risks and audit committees, and I think in the PCAOB's recent staff alert on this on their discussions with audit committees, cyber risk and the risk of fraud and cyber came up as one of their audit committee concern topics. So I think as from an audit perspective, obviously cyber risk is broader than risk of financial misstatements risk, but certainly going to be an area of consideration and discussions with those component auditors, as Dora mentioned. So sorry, I want to do a quick sidebar on that. So, the travel restrictions and the remote auditing has certainly been a challenge, a growing challenge. I think when you think about the timing of when things started the pandemic started to really impact auditing. Most of the 1231 jobs, the group audits, larger group audits, had been through the discussions. There've been reviews. I mean, we're kind of getting into the March timeframe where audits were wrapping up or had been issued. So it has grown, I think from an impact on the jobs as, with more of the off year ends, you started to think about, getting the 331s out, now the 630s going out. And then gearing up for year end as we start to recognize that this isn't going to be people are going to, well, depending on what state you live in, you're going to be wearing a mask for a while now. I think that's been part of the challenge, and I think this starting to see this as it relates to, okay, how are we going to, I think Julie mentioned it in her opening remarks about the agility of the profession and the ability to adapt and develop workarounds. I think that the firms have recognized that. I think they have moved through, how the teams can communicate more often with respect to issues arising, getting those issues raised sooner with clients, obviously leveraging technology and Joe's comments about how is this going to look going forward. Some type of hybrid approach seems to resonate with a lot of us. I mean, I don't think, I've been auditing for a lot of years, so I would hesitate to say we can go all remote and life is good, and this has been a great revelation for the practice that we don't need to go visit our clients and sit across from them and ask them questions anymore. So I think that's something that we're going to leverage technology to the extent we can. I think as we start to move towards, as firms are recognizing, as we're moving towards the volume of the 1231 audits that are going to be coming up, are there going to be some challenges where we're really going to have a stretch with respect to whether or not we're getting enough evidence in a group audit from the component auditor due to either restrictions or just challenges that the lead auditor might have with respect to, am I comfortable with the evidence I'm getting? So I do think we're going to see the lead audit teams, group auditors doing more. They may be reaching out directly more to some of the component audit management from a corroborative perspective with respect to some of the work that's done with respect to follow-up. I think this is kind of a work in progress for most of the firms right now as it relates to the guidance that they're providing to the teams as they start to look at where these hot buttons are going to come out with respect to, can I leverage technology enough to get the answers? Is the documentation going to be sufficient that I'm getting from the component auditor, and my discussions with them going to be sufficient for me to get comfortable that that I'm ready to sign that opinion from a lead audit or group audit perspective. So not a lot of easy answers yet. I think we're in progress, but certainly going to be an interesting challenge and firms are certainly, as Julie said, agile and getting ready to gear up for this. So.
Yeah, and clearly the travel restrictions are not a free pass to the lead auditor to say, well, that's something I wanted to do to effectively oversee and provide the right level of supervision over the component auditor. There's going to be ways to overcome, maybe not physically traveling to a location, but obviously, as we're doing here today with collaboration tools and the like, technology has made it a lot easier for us to be able to virtually interact with our teams globally. And we're just going to have to fulfill that requirement.
We still need to meet the standards, George.
Yeah,
right?
we need to meet the standards. So there is no pass to say, well, I couldn't travel, therefore I'm not going to do what I was intending to do by traveling. I'm going to have to figure out another way of getting to that same place ultimately.
George, if I could just kind of give one piece of perspective on this. I think Mark described it from the auditor's perspective. I think the SEC have done a really good job in reminding issuers that they need to deal with the same constraints. And one of the things we keep on reminding audit teams is whenever we start this discussion, start with what has the preparer done on their side to close their books and records, whatever constraint the auditor faces. You're almost assured that the company is facing a similar constraint around their location professionals closing the books and records and so on. So it's always worth reminding ourselves just at some point that auditing follows what preparers assert and what preparers do, and they have many of these same challenges they're dealing with.
Yeah, very good. So let's pivot to regulatory access issues. So maybe I'll start with Matt. With the background we just covered on how group audits are executed and shifting to current events and why group audits and audits in emerging markets have been in the news. Maybe Matt, can you explain to us what the current landscape looks like with respect to regulatory and legislative actions for audits in emerging markets, including recent history of issues from a financial reporting standpoint, PCAOB comments with respect to access to work papers in China and other jurisdictions, and other joint statements between the PCAOB and the SEC related to emerging markets.
Sure. Group audits are in the news because of the ongoing struggles that regulators have had to achieve the completeness of global access that they need to fulfill their mandates. And more specifically to the on-again, off-again, now very much on-again focus that is getting from the U.S. And all of that is against the backdrop of high-profile frauds and audit failures that, unfortunately, our world can be counted on to supply to reinforce the point. Wirecard's $2 billion of cash that's not in the Philippines, and Luckin Coffee's $300 million of revenue that's not in China come to mind. Group audits, and in particular audits in emerging markets, have been a focus area for regulators really for quite some time. The PCAOB raised concerns regarding information access challenges that they face in emerging markets and their inability to perform inspections, specifically in China, since shortly after their inception, and have issued SAP alerts on group audits and emerging market risk back in 2010 and 2011. But recently, we have seen increased messaging from the SEC and the PCAOB on emerging market risks and regulatory challenges, and there's been increased calls for legislative or regulatory actions to enforce existing regulatory requirements. In the past 9 months, the SEC and the PCAOB has issued a number of joint statements on the important role of the inspection process and access challenges in China. Just this past July, the SEC held emerging market roundtable discussions on these challenges and the increased risk of emerging market investments. In addition to these public statements, the SEC and the PCAOB have held meetings with the senior members of the large global audit firms to discuss their concerns and to emphasize the important oversight roles that these firms have of their Chinese member firms, and for the supervision of component auditors. Separately, the U.S. Senate unanimously approved a bill, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, in May on the topic, and the House introduced a similar bill. Finally, the White House issued a memorandum on protecting U.S. investors from significant risks in China and Chinese companies on June 4th. So, to summarize, the recent landscape has become very, very active.
Thank you, Matt. Matt mentioned the SEC's Emerging Markets Roundtable on July 9th. Julie Bell Lindsay of the CAQ sat on a panel representing the profession and gave an overview of the audits in emerging markets. Can I ask you to maybe just summarize the key discussions that were held as part of that panel?
Yeah, there was definitely as you guys have been mentioning, the continued focus by the SEC and the PCAOB, the regulators, on this topic. So the panel was covered several hours and had various investor focus aspects. The panel that you mentioned, Julie was on, and thanks Julie for participating in that, and so we're representing the profession on that. With respect to audit quality issues in emerging markets, and what are the firms doing, right? I think the impetus was to say, okay, here, yes, we recognize that there are challenges, and however you define an emerging market, as Philip mentioned, with the focus on some of the challenges with respect to not being able to inspect in China, which has been such a growing market for investment. So I think part of the discussion, and I think some of the education that Julie provided, was what are the larger firms doing with respect to managing their quality in these areas. So and how does a global network work? Kind of the areas of focus of I think Julie mentioned brand. Yes, it's important to have a brand, but more importantly, what is our global quality initiative for a larger multinational firm, and what are our common strategic approaches? So I think there are reasons for that the firm has different combination of network firm, a combination of member firms that comprise a network. And then what do they agree to? And I think this was some of the things that Julie got into in the panel, was what does the firm agree to when they join this network? A common methodology, quality control requirements around client acceptance, for example, is an important one with respect to what a member firm needs to consider with respect to their responsibilities to the network. Training, being able to participate in training sufficient to be able to provide support to a PCAOB audit. That's another important aspect of the multinational firm. And then being subject to inspections. So I know, there is a heightened focus on inspections. Part of the panel discussion was the importance of, both internal firm inspections that are performed, as well as the regulator inspections by the PCAOB or the local jurisdiction, or a combination of both, depending on how that jurisdiction set up. So overall, the overarching quality control risk management aspects of a network firm were discussed. I think it was, a very helpful for the investors who are participating or observing this panel. It's available, as on the SEC website for further, if anybody wants to go look at it. I think there are other aspects of the discussion also included, comments from enforcement and DOJ on what their concerns are with respect to some of the actions they might take in an emerging market. And Matt, you teed up a couple of some of the recent issues with respect to, some of the multinational, large firms where investors have been damaged with respect to, from a reporting perspective. I think some of the other, just wrapping up, George, some of the other areas that Julie touched on were, some of the things we've been talking about with respect to what makes a good group audit. What's the lead partner responsible for? What are the ultimate responsibility for getting the scoping right, identifying the key component work. Where is the from a group audit, the risk assessment perspective we talked about. So, I think it was a helpful panel to get into, some of the key other areas that the group auditor thinks about with respect to, scoping and regulatory restrictions and the like. It was helpful to have Chairman Dunkey on as well to talk about, what their inspection process is with respect to, how group audits and in emerging markets. When you think about the panel also touched on things outside of group audits, which I know we're focused on group audits, but when you think about a registrant domiciled in an emerging market and what quality control standards require for them, a review by from a member firm perspective, we call them the vernaculars and Appendix K review. That's from way back in the day, but the PCAOB's adopted those standards so that a U.S. expert is knowledgeable in independence auditing and accounting will review those filings. It's kind of a desk review of that as an added quality control. So I think sum up, Julie indicated the profession's doing, stepping up, doing what they can, especially through this pandemic, to manage through the, in the emerging markets. And I think clearly, as Chairman Donkey commented in the panel, it's we're still not able to verify in some of these jurisdictions, and that's a problem. So I think that was helpful for the investors to hear that. So.
Okay. Great summary, Mike. Appreciate it. Philip, Matt mentioned the Senate having passed the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which looked to suspend trading of existing Chinese companies from U.S. capital markets over a 3-year period, so long as the PCAOB inspection issue remains unresolved. The House has now also passed a similar bill. Can you talk about how these bills, as currently drafted, might affect global audits?
Sure, and just by way of a little background for all of us, the challenges that the SEC have laid forward for other markets who participate in the U.S. exchanges to be an appropriate level of regulation date way back. Specific to China, Chairman Cox in October 2005 pointed out that the cost of appropriate regulation was far exceeded by its benefits, and pointed out that the exchange, the commission at that stage, would like nothing more than to work closely with China as China's reform process heightened the importance of state-of-the-art securities laws, sound financial reporting practices, and stringent disclosure rules. Now, of course, the progress has been tortuously slow. And I think what we're seeing this year in the regulatory world with the House and the Senate is the next stage of the US response to barriers being put up to putting that kind of stringent security exchange regulation in place, to allowing access to the SEC and to the PCAOB, to allow that to be done effectively and to permit the reach into a market that has a very significant participation in US capital raising. So you get into this whole question of where does it go next. I think at the same time as all of that was occurring, the chairman of the China Securities Regulatory Commission, Chairman Yang, also decided to respond with a speech which some of us have described as a suspended reality moment. If you listen to Chairman Yang's speech, you would easily conclude that the Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission believes they've made such progress and they're very close to being complete. I don't know where we land between those 2 points. This is a political response to a regulatory challenge. It is certainly a strong signal that those countries who participate in US equity markets will need to make changes. And if those changes do not get made, and there's adequate time notification here. As you point out, there's a 3-year period, so there's a decent period for countries to make changes. Then the US environment will allow suspending of trading of those shares, and I guess will not allow any new IPOs to be brought to market until these conditions are fixed. That's going to raise some challenges. If it's an ongoing client, clearly the US audit parent or the audit parent wherever the world with a very strong component in China will be worrying about the knock-on effect. Is there flow through to envelope or shelf listed companies where the majority of operations may lie elsewhere? I think the capital markets are going to be troubled until certainty is reached. So I suppose, George, it comes down to what your gamble is. If Belgium and France are any indication, I guess this may be the moment where the next large market moves more constructively towards giving access. And if that is achieved, then I'm not sure there's a huge impact on audits. There may be an impact on auditors in those markets if they're not performing audits at the required standard. But assuming we're all doing audits of the highest standard of quality, then this access will allow the regulatory process to function effectively.
Thank you, Philip. Maybe one final comment before we open it up to some Q&As that have come in. Maybe for you, Matt, we focused heavily on U.S. regulatory oversight, whether it be SEC or PCAOB, on the panel discussion so far, but global regulators have increasingly taken an active hand in multi-jurisdictional oversight as well. So how are global regulators viewing some of these issues, including the FRC, for example, in the UK?
With considerable unanimity. I mean, these regulators seem to be getting along swimmingly, making China really stick out more as an exception. Because as global network firms, we really see how closely and extensively these regulators are able to work together. And in general, I would say that the regulatory authorities share the views of the U.S. that cross-border cooperation and sharing of information are important elements of their oversight that enhance audit quality. Like the U.S. regulators, they all work with each other to grant access and that they need to fulfill their missions. Sorry about my video. There it goes. There are some differences worthy of note, and at least in terms of emphasis, and a particularly interesting one is in the context of the group audits that we've been talking about, and it's the posture of the UK's FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, who have imposed incremental requirements when it comes to supervision and review of components that go beyond the requirements of ISO 600. And they issued a directive back in 2016 that effectively mandates a review of component auditors' work that, as I said, goes beyond what the ISO 600 explicitly does. So as hard as a time as we're all having with, fulfilling our requirements as group auditors in a pandemic, I think our UK member firms may have it even tougher. The international auditing standards also include a couple of requirements for enhanced disclosures about key audit matters under ISO 701 and the auditor's responsibility for other information included in documents that include financial statements and ISO 720. So, for example, auditors may disclose decisions about key judgments like the decision to serve as the group auditor or the involvement, significant involvement of component auditors in their statutory audit opinions. In some jurisdictions, there's also other obligations placed on the auditor under laws and regulations to report specifically on things outside the financial statements. But in most cases, the auditor is required to read that information and evaluate whether there are material inconsistencies with the audited financial statements. So regulators remain very much focused on the adequate disclosure of risk, be it accounting, audit related to the users of financial statements.
Great, thanks, Matt. So with that, I want to thank the panel for your participation so far. Let's jump into a few questions that have come in. So maybe, Dora, I'll go to you with the first one. Can you comment on whether there's generally a uniform audit methodology for the member firms within a firm's global network, and maybe give a sense of how often a group audit includes firms within the firm's global network versus firms that might be outside the network?
Yeah, most of the larger firms use ISO 600 as really the basis for their group audit methodology, and so the larger network firms. And so I do think that you'll see that as a foundational basis for how methodologies are executed. And I think over the last few years, especially, we've found that our communications with component auditors are improved when everybody's singing from the same song sheet, right? So understanding what that global methodology is and taking actions to really make sure that it is communicated across the network makes for an easier group audit. So I do think that you are seeing a lot of consistency with how group audits start to be executed within a network. From the perspective of using auditors outside of a network, there's a lot of variation in that. I think someone had mentioned earlier that having a consistent methodology and knowing what your firm expects when you're testing certain areas and having a standard or a uniform technology really helps drive and improve the quality of the audit, and it helps the group engagement team know and understand the work that's being performed. And so there's a lot of benefits in many cases to using component auditors that are from the network. But we have seen more and more jurisdictions that have auditor rotation requirements. And so you do definitely see the use of other firms that are outside of the network come in on group audits. That being said, the professional standards are agnostic towards whether the firm is in or out of a network. And so those same requirements as it relates to direction, supervision, oversight apply regardless of whether the firm is in network or out of network. There just may be some differences in how the group engagement team goes about executing that. And some things are maybe not as easy as they would be with an in-network firm.
Dora, it's interesting as you describe that. We are seeing, as you noted, that with auditor firm rotation, there's more occasion where a location has an entity that's of local significance and has to rotate their local auditor, which is causing its own knock-on effect. At the same time, we have the commentary of the ICAEW, the German regulator, to the PCAOB standard in 2016, the new ISO 600, the ISQM 1 conditions around network, where more emphasis has been placed on the network level controls and how the network level controls, when documented and communicated and tested, are of importance to the network. So I can see this going to become a very interesting case to juxtapose. If you're using firms within a network where you have common methodology, common training standards, as Mark described, commonality of forms and templates and technology, it must logically flow that there is a different group auditor set of information to gather and responses to be taken. There's access to more information around inspection outcomes, the nature of the people being used, compared to firms that are working without that network layer of control support. So it's another spot where academics might start studying and thinking through ahead, what are those differences and how does that impact the outcome?
Yeah, great point, both of you. Thanks for that. Matt, let me ask you this question that came in. In what way, if any, do you think the recently adopted requirements related to Form AP have impacted the lead auditor's choice and or monitoring of component auditors?
I mean, I'm not sure that it has. It has created a significant compliance challenge. It's not easy to get that Form AP right, particularly on these multinationals with so many components and things like that. I mean, the objective is to provide that transparency to the user of the financial statements to understand for themselves, what is the nature of the audit and what are the risks related to how the audit team has been composed, so that you can look up for yourself and understand what the quality history is of all the component auditors that are meet the qualifications for, or the threshold to be included in that Form AP. But even before Form AP, there were requirements about the need to use only firms that are registered to practice before the PCAOB. So that narrowed the choice enough right there. And of course, global network firms are strongly incented really to work with their own member firms because of all the synergies that you can enjoy in that respect.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Mike, maybe we may have time for just one more. I'll come to you with this one. The PCAOB from time to time have made public comments about or encouraging audit committees to ask questions of their auditors about the component auditors and how they coordinate the quality of that work. Are we seeing those questions coming? Are audit committees engaging in this topic in terms of their communications with auditors? And if so, what kinds of questions do we think that are being raised as part of that dialogue?
Yeah, I think I think it's kind of been both ways, George. I think the firms themselves have been providing more detail around the use of the components, and I think that's been an important aspect of the getting the audit committee, engaged in the planning. The PCAOB standard, it came out a few years ago. I think it was AS16 on audit committees and enhancing those communication responsibilities. What's the minimum? And I think the audit committees are more engaged in that. I think there has been more of a focus on, what has been any of the inspection issues that may have come out of an inspection of a component. I think there've been a few jurisdictions where there have been, in the news a little bit more with respect to, some auditing challenges from a quality perspective. So I think that's been a topic of discussion at the C-suite and also with the audit committee.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. And with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists, and I'd like to thank you for participating with us virtually today. Hopefully you found it useful and good discussion.